Good evening, and welcome to the Wilton Historical Society. My name is Nick Foster. I'm the director here, and normally I'm the one introducing the speaker before they come on, but since it's just me tonight, you've got me. So I'm going to kind of launch into this. So welcome to a lecture called How Revolutionary Wilton and Fairfield County in the War for Independence. And we're also going to touch on Connecticut and just the Revolution a little bit more broadly. But I will start by saying that the origin of this lecture actually goes back many years. I was reading a really fantastic book called Patriot Battles by Michael Stevenson. And it's a really great book about 18th century warfare if you're a massive nerd like I am. And at the beginning of the book, Stevenson makes the case that the term American Revolution is actually a bit of a misnomer. And in reality, it's not a revolution, it's a war for independence. And it sounds like a sort of a pedantic semantic argument, but I think it has some merits. And I've been thinking about this question quite a bit for the last 4 years because, again, nerd. And also the fact that about a year later, several Wilton High School teachers got in touch with me and said, we're working on a Revolutionary War unit. And the sort of pressing question of the unit is, how radical was the revolution? And they said, can you talk about this? And I was like, finally, a reason for me to look into this on company time. This is great. And I said, absolutely, I'd love to come in. So I started looking through our archives to look at sort of what we had on the revolution that was really specific to Wilton and the area. Because whenever we look at history, we want to eschew the sort of great man theory of history. It's Washington and John Hancock and Adams. They're the ones pushing the revolution forward. And of course, we know that the revolution is actually driven by everyday people doing everyday things, right? You join the revolution as a common farmer in Massachusetts fighting at Lexington and Concord. These are the people that make the revolution go. So I was looking at what is it that we can find in Wilton that sort of supports this thesis of the revolution's not actually a revolution, but something else. So with that, I wanted to define our terms, because if we're looking at the question of how revolutionary, we need to know what a revolution is. What is it? So I'll hit you with the Webster's Dictionary definition, which is a sudden, radical, or complete change, or a fundamental change in political organization. So it's sort of two definitions in one. And I like the first half more than I like the second half. For a number of reasons. But one being is I like the idea of sudden and complete change. I think that's a key element of this. Because when we look at the term revolution and we look at the American Revolution, how sudden and complete is the change? And I also don't like the fact the dictionary definition using political organization, because I don't think political and revolution necessarily need to go together, right? There are plenty of examples of revolutions that are not political. Well, I mean, everything is political, but not political explicitly in nature. The agrarian revolution, the industrial revolution, the sexual revolution. These are examples of things that don't have any outcomes on political structures, right, but are still sudden, rapid changes. And there's also fundamental political changes that aren't necessarily revolutions as we think about it. You think about African Americans getting the right to vote in Reconstruction, women getting the right to vote. These are fundamental changes in the political order, but we wouldn't necessarily classify them as revolutions, right? So I'm really looking at this idea of sudden, radical, complete change of society, of a government system. That's sort of what I want our framing device to be as we talk tonight. So of course, there's all sorts of reasons why people would join a revolution. We look at the American Revolution, and I'll use American Revolution and War for Independence somewhat interchangeably. But we look at the revolution gains speed during the late 1760s and into the early 1770s. By September of 1774, you have the First Continental Congress convenes. This was a response to the intolerable acts of the previous year, and as well as a few other incidents involving King George and Parliament leading up to that. And what the First Continental Congress does is they pass the Articles of Confederation in 1774, and you can see a portion of that here. And what these Articles of Association are is sort of the first opening salvo of addressing the king for grievances, somewhat officially. And it's, as I mentioned, passed in late October 1774 with a sort of start date for this document on December 1st of 1774. And what this does is the first chance where people really have to take official sides. Because across the colonies, you start to get the colonies and towns making votes on whether or not they're going to follow these resolutions and articles that Continental Congress has laid out. And Norwalk is, which still includes Wilton at this time, so for those who don't know, Wilton is technically a part of Norwalk from 1726 through to 1802. So if you see Norwalk in a document before 1802, it includes Wilton. So the Wilton was semi-autonomous, but for purposes of this, they join Norwalk when they're voting. So Norwalk immediately on December 5th votes to have its own committee of safety and follow these articles. So committee of safety basically being sort of the political action group that's going to enact these articles as they've been represented here. So actually the Article 11 here is concerning sort of a committee of safety. So Norwalk within 4 days is like, yes, we are on board, we hate King George, this is terrible, let's go. But it's not a full-blown rebellion yet. This is just concerned citizens writing a strongly worded letter at this point, maybe a little something beyond that, but it's sort of the first step. So not all the towns are as gung-ho about it as Norwalk is across Fairfield County. Our neighbors to the north, Ridgefield, they actually met 3 times between January and April of 1775, and each time they're basically like, absolutely not. We are loyal to the crown, we're not entertaining this, we're not dealing with it. That last vote in April was 3 days before Lexington and Concord. They quickly changed their tune. And by December of 1775, Ridgefield decides to enact a committee of safety and move forward with this. Some of this was done through political pressure. Some towns like Wilton actually said, we're not going to do business with some of these towns that haven't voted to enact the articles. This wasn't across the board. Every town had sort of their levels of boycotts, but the Patriots started placing some pressure on people who were still sort of considering themselves loyalists. Now that being said, as much as Norwalk was a Patriot strong, and Wilton by extension a Patriot stronghold, not everybody in these communities were on board with how things were voted. You often hear the commonly cited stat from John Adams that during the Revolution, 1/3 were loyalists, 1/3 were patriots, and 1/3 were neutral as far as across the colonies. Now, I have a lot of quibbles with this stat. I think it is a good sort of rough indication of how divided the colonies certainly were. But even the label of patriot and loyalist is a bit nebulous, as we'll actually talk about in a little bit. These labels adjust pretty quickly and ebb and flow as the conflict continues. But many different factors went into why people would choose one of these sides. Certainly economics. Taxes are one of the main things. This is a commonly cited thing when we talk about cause of the revolution is taxation. But religion certainly went into it. The Anglican Church, which was common throughout the colonies, the Anglican Church being the Church of England, with the king, the monarch of England being the lead of that church. You can imagine if you were Anglican, you were more likely to remain loyal to the crown, and we find that in Wilton. Most of the loyalists here in Wilton had ties to the Anglican Church, although it's not always a one-to-one. We have Anglicans who are patriots, and we have Congregationalists who remain loyal to the crown. But religion certainly would have been one factor. But there's all sorts of things. Just looking at things like wealth. Certainly, whether or not you had an economic tie to England, wealth, generally speaking, would as it does today. Broadly speaking, wealth is an indicator of how sort of conservative or progressive you are. There's obviously that's a generalization, but we see wealthier people in these communities tend to be a little bit more loyalist. One of Wilton's most notable loyalists is the gentleman who's depicted in this document here. So Samuel Belden was a descendant of the Beldens, proprietors of Norwalk. The Belden family goes back to the Norwalk area, back to the 1660s. Samuel Belden lived here in Wilton. His family was incredibly wealthy for the area. The Beldens lived in an area, some of the Beldens lived in an area that was known as Egypt up in Cannondale because of how strong the wheat grew there. So they were sort of wealthy, prosperous farmers. Samuel Belden owned a general store where he was constantly sort of one of the biggest stores in town. And Belden was actually a member of the Anglican Church as well. So when the war breaks out, Samuel Belden, in this document here, this is from 1769. Belden is actually being made the cornet of the Wilton militia. So he's being promoted to an officer in the Wilton militia, which becomes relevant later because in 1776 he's actually elevated to captain of the militia cavalry, a very prestigious position. And then almost immediately he gets court-martialed because he didn't motivate his troops fast enough in 1776. So basically he decides, you know, I don't believe in this war, I'm not going to be a part of it, and actually his court-martial goes all the way up to General Silliman, who's one of the militia generals here in Connecticut, and you can see him listed among here above some of the expenses for the colony at later state of Connecticut during the war. Now the issues with the militia aren't limited to ideology. Belden was doing on ideological grounds. We had other Wilton militiamen who were on the Patriot side who also had issues. So in April of 1775, we have a man by the name of Clapp Raymond. Clapp was a blacksmith in town, a prominent member of the community. His house is the greenhouse that's at the end of the Historical Society property here. I encourage you to come back and take a look at it. He was actually in April of 1775 called before the General Assembly of Connecticut because he also refused to join the revolution, mostly because he got passed over for promotion. I was looking at the resolution the General Assembly passed, and what they said was, Clapp Raymond of Norwalk in said regiment, lieutenant of company militia in the parish of Wilton, in said Norwalk, of which Matthew Meade is captain, hath, ever since Meade was established and commissioned as captain of said company, wholly refused to obey the orders of said captain or do his duty as lieutenant in said company in any respect. So basically, Clapp Raymond, who is an ardent patriot, somebody who really believes in the cause, gets passed over for promotion and goes, you know what, I'm taking my ball and going home. I'm not putting up with this. So you can see that, you know, even these entrenched ideologues are not necessarily supporting the revolution, you know, if it's not going to boost their ego. So again, this sliding scale of who's patriot and who's loyalist and what they're contributing tends to ebb and flow throughout the conflict. Another famous loyalist in Wilton is David Lambert. David Lambert Jr., or the David Lambert II. He was Wilton's first college graduate. Here is his diploma from Yale in the 1750s. Lambert was one of, if not the wealthiest man in Wilton at the time. The Lamberts were incredibly wealthy. They had married into high society. They married a member of the Gracie family of the Gracie Mansion in New York. Lambert was also tied to through marriage to Thomas Fitch, who was the Connecticut colonial governor in the 1760s. So Lamberts are quite wealthy. Lambert is also a member of the Anglican Church, and he also was a merchant. He dealt with overseas commerce. So during, as the sort of conflict ramps up, he's looking at where he gets his money. It's from British goods. He's not about to screw up that relationship. So he decides to remain loyal. And as I said, as a wealthy member of the community, he's a little bit more, let's not upset the apple cart here, guys. So we start to see people sort of shift into a couple different baskets here as the conflict really takes off. And the first time, other than if you were in the militia, the first time you really had to pick a side was during the Battle of Ridgefield, at least as far as in Wilton. So this area, you could kind of coast along without declaring yourself one way or the other necessarily, right up until April of 1775. That's when the war comes to your front door. So if you're not familiar with the Battle of Ridgefield, the broad strokes of it is that the British, after taking New York City, decide that they're going to raid into Connecticut, steal some supplies, and sort of devastate the Connecticut countryside, and shows these rowdy patriots a lesson. And they land in Westport, they march up to Danbury, burn some of the city, march down through Ridgefield, and then fight a battle, and then the aftermath spills over into Wilton and then down to Westport. We have a great video on our website if you'd like to hear a little bit more about this. The Westport Museum also has a great video called Action at Westport that goes into some of the details. So if you're looking for more information, I highly recommend it. I mentioned the Battle of Ridgefield a little bit because I'm really proud of a document we have in our collection that is actually related to the battle. This document here was possibly the last thing David Worcester, who was a general general who fought for the Patriots. He's killed at the Battle of Ridgefield, and this document that we have in the collection may be the last thing he ever signed, or at least the last thing he ever signed that still survives. Worcester, this document here is basically Worcester writing to his General Silliman, who we mentioned earlier as a militia general, writing to say, hey, the British have landed on the shores, we need some help. And he writes this letter off to Silliman, and Silliman writes back and says, okay, gather up, I'm calling all the Minutemen, we'll be coming to you shortly. And you can see the signature there, April 26, 1777. I timed this lecture for a reason. But it's April 26, 1777. You can see Worcester's signature there. He is shot in he's wounded in Ridgefield the next day, and later dies on May 2nd. So Battle of Ridgefield takes place tonight. This document's actually currently on display at the Greenwich Historical Society for an exhibit. How do we know about what happened in Wilton during the Battle of Ridgefield? Well, a couple different things. And this goes into that research I was mentioning earlier. So this document here is from 1853. It is written by a first-hand account of the Battle of Ridgefield in Wilton, Abijah Betts. And Betts tells two quick stories about what was happening in Wilton and the aftermath of the Battle of Ridgefield as the British marched through. And there's the Clap Raymond's house here from the outside. So the British basically marched down through Ridgefield Road through Wilton. They raided several houses. There was quite a bit of sort of skirmishing going on in Wilton because, as I mentioned, it was very much a patriot community. There were only about 24 loyalists at any given time. So the Minutemen were really out in force in Wilton and Westport and Ridgefield during the battle. At one point, actually, the British marched into the house at 11 Belden Hill Road, where they encountered, that was the house of Daniel Gregory. They encountered Daniel's aged mother, who, as the British marched in, took out a fireplace poker and proceeded to threaten the Redcoats as they marched in. Apparently, she wanted to show them which side she was on. So, as I mentioned, sort of strong feelings in 1777. So, one of the houses, or one of the places the British actually do go in, is the house of Samuel Belden, the man I mentioned earlier. And you can see the quote here. Some of I won't read the whole thing, but Governor Tryon, who is the British colonial governor of New York and also the general sort of leading this expedition, it says that his guards entered the store of Samuel Belden, which there was quite a bit of merchandise in the store, and they set out to start destroying everything. And at that point, Mrs. Belden just lets the British know that, you know, these actually belong, all the goods in here belong to loyalists, specifically some loyalists from New York City. And, you know, we're on your side, please don't destroy everything. And the British are convinced by this and they leave. So they say, you know what, yep, you're a loyalist, you're good. The British actually had some local loyalist units marching with them, so they were familiar with the area and they were familiar with who in the community was actually loyal. So they go next door to the Raymond house. And they knew that Clap Raymond was a member, by this point he had come back, he was a member of the militia again, and that he was actually storing supplies for the Continental Army in his barn, as well as using his blacksmith forge to supply the Continental Army. So this account from Abijah Betts says, they found Continental stores and set fire immediately to the barn. So the barn goes up in flames, and who comes and puts the fire out but Mrs. Belden, as well as Mrs. Belden's sister. So here we have this example of, you know, this community that was somewhat divided. The Beldens, you know, were getting Samuel Belden was getting court-martialed for the fact that he didn't want to join the revolution. But when the British show up and they light fire to their neighbors' barns, political ideologies go out the window, and the Beldens come over and help put the fire out because they were neighbors first, sort of political opponents second, right? So I think it's a really interesting example of, you know, how these relationships were forged. Now, the Beldens could have been doing somewhat out of self-preservation. If the British march through, burn everything, and the Belden house is the only one left standing, well, they're going to have to answer some questions, right? So how much this is self-preservation versus, you know, sort of neighborly goodwill remains to be seen. But I thought it was an interesting example of, you know, we go back to that question of how revolutionary, you know, if the Beldens were sort of looking at this revolutionary force that they wanted to put down, you know, as far as they were concerned, maybe the Raymonds were getting what they deserved, but in this case, we see some compassion. So I move on to this second document. This is a letter from, what's the date? I'm so sorry. November 1780. So this is a few years after the Battle of Ridgefield. This is a letter from Norwalk militiaman Eliphalet Lockwood to Gold-Sellick Silliman, the man I mentioned before. And he's describing the conditions in Connecticut in 1780. So now we're 5 years into this conflict. And it's pointing out basically how bleak it is to live in Fairfield County, and because of how difficult of a situation they're in, what people are resorting to. And one of those things they're resorting to is black market trade. So this is a good example. Lockwood writes to Silliman and he goes, the men, he saw Lockwood as a militiaman, he's writing to his superior officer to say what his fellow militiamen are experiencing. And he goes, the men are much discouraged in their duty for want of money or provisions, having not got their wages for the last year. The only thing that keeps up their spirits is their country's cause. And I thought this was interesting because here we are, these guys are not getting paid, they're not, they're starving in many cases. The Continental Army was constantly racked with these issues of keeping soldiers around because wages didn't come through. They were constantly undersupplied. Soldiers were constantly leaving, going to go back to their farms and raise their crops, tend to their livestock, and then would rejoin the army later. It was a constant difficulty to keep soldiers, to the point that actually later in the war, the Continental Army starts offering land bounties, basically saying to these guys, listen, we can't pay you now, but if you join and fight through the end of the war, we'll promise you some land that we'll just give it to you. So the Continental Army gets desperate, and this is a first-hand account of someone pointing out this desperation. But these guys, listen, their ideology is driving them. They're saying, we believe in this cause, we believe in the revolution, it doesn't matter if we get paid or not, this is a righteous thing to do when we're here. Now, that's not the case for everybody. As I mentioned, Lockwood starts pointing out the issues they're having with what he calls illicit commerce. Now, during the war, Long Island is a British stronghold. And Long Island, in many cases, is 8 to 10 miles across the Sound. So it's an easy place where these sort of various raids happen. Silliman actually at one point is actually kidnapped from his house in Fairfield by British raiders who come across the Sound and grab him in the middle of the night. But it was also a way that these sort of small boats could come across the Sound and start smuggling things, both in and out of Fairfield County. Lockwood describes it as these boats carry and fetch traders, they go back and forth, they land in fields that the guards, where they know they're going to avoid the guards. He's saying there's 20 or more of these guys, and they do no other business than fetching goods and selling them about, while British goods are allowed to come in among us and be carried about. So essentially he's pointing out a major problem. The British are trying to undermine the Continental Army, or the Continental economy here in Connecticut. They're bringing their goods over because basically the Americans don't have any. The British show up with their goods and say, oh, you can buy from us. And naturally, that's going to undermine supplies and money going to the Continental Army. But if you're starving, you don't have supplies, British goods start to become, more attractive. You think about the fact that, at the start of the war, these people are gung-ho. People in Norwalk are like, yep, everybody's on board, let's fight the war. 5 years later, your economic downturn comes. Suddenly, you don't quite care who's in charge as long as you're getting your food, your supplies, your money, and everything else. And it works the same way. Actually, one of the things he mentions is, Lockwood says, I think the farmers will hold their produce for that purpose, and that purpose being trading overseas. So British goods were coming in from Long Island, but also American farmers, patriot farmers, were saying, we're not going to give this to the Continental Army, we're going to give it to these smugglers, and they can bring it to Long Island and pay us for it. So again, they're sort of cutting out the Continental Army from the cause. So while people were still throughout the war sort of labeled patriots in Fairfield County, their actions seem to indicate otherwise. And that, again, that sliding ideology as the war continues. One of the things they mention actually here is that basically the American paper money was worth what the money was printed on and not much more. So the next document I'm going to look at, and before we actually get to that, I want to point out another cool historical document. This is I'm mentioning Samuel Parsons because he's relevant to the next document, but Parsons actually stayed here. Samuel Parsons was one of the Connecticut militia generals. He actually stayed here in Wilton in July of 1779. He stayed at the Marvin Tavern, this yellow building here that's still in front of Wilton High School. This was one of the longest running taverns in Wilton. Parsons stayed there, and while he was there, wrote a letter to George Washington about the burning of Norwalk, and that letter you can see here. And the thing that I like about it is that at the top of the document, he wrote Norwalk and then crossed it out and wrote Wilton. So at this point, the name Wilton was starting to stick. You know, our reputation was getting high enough that Parsons said, no, I'm not Norwalk anymore, I'm in Wilton, which I thought was cool. So anyway, this document here is from March of 1781, so a few months after that previous document was written. And now the issue of this illicit commerce has gone up the ladder of the Continental Army. This is General Parsons, who I mentioned, writing to Governor John Trumbull. And he's basically going, I've decided to take action about these smugglers, and I need you to help me. And what he says is basically, I'm rounding up anyone and everyone I can find who is potentially a smuggler. He says, so he's doing what he's called examinations, basically these sort of interrogations. He's asking around, you know, where can I find these guys? And he says, by perusing these examinations, you will find some are accused on report only, and some from personal knowledge. So essentially what he's doing, and he mentions that he actually has arrested 47 people at this point. And he's arrested 47 people. By report only basically means by hearsay. Neighbors are saying, yeah, I think this guy's involved in smuggling, and they're just grabbing these guys. Some of it is from personal knowledge, so some witnesses, but the sort of, the threshold of evidence is pretty low. And Parsons just grabbing up these guys. And he's writing to Trumbull basically to say, and I'm looking for an act of government for court-martial, which I haven't gotten yet. The only way I'm going to be able to do anything about these guys is if I actually put them on trial for something. And I'm looking for your advice on how to do that. And I found this really fascinating for the main reason that one of the reasons listed in the Declaration of Independence for why the colonists decided to go to war is being held without jury trial. And you can see that here. It actually says one of the grievances are we're being held without trial, and here we are 6 years into the conflict, and the Americans are basically doing roughly the same thing. Not to the extent that King George or Parliament was doing it necessarily, but basically they've scooped up these guys with little evidence because they're in crisis mode. These smugglers are undermining the Constitution, or undermining the Continental Army, and we're doing the best we can, and we're going to hold them without trial because it's better than the alternative. So when we, again, going back to that framing device of how revolutionary is this, is this the sign of people who are committed to the cause that they're fighting for? Or has circumstances outweighed the belief, the revolution and the change that they want to bring, or are they just trying to survive? So when I talked earlier about that label of loyalist, patriot, neutral, here, to me, this is an example of people in a community responding in real time to outside influences and changing their political ideology, or at least the extent of their political ideology, right? So I don't actually know if there ever a court-martial happened. I haven't been able to find any evidence of it. It possibly just doesn't survive. But the next document I found is one that I really like just purely because of the language in it. This is from January 1783. And this is a few months before the end of the war. It's after Yorktown, but it's before the Treaty of Paris is signed. So the war is still technically going on, but for all intents and purposes, it's over. And the inhabitants of Norwalk write to, which again includes Wilton, are writing to the Governor and General Assembly of Connecticut going, we got to do something about these loyalists. I love the language in here, and I'm going to read this whole quote because of how much I love what they write in here. Which induces us at this time to implore that you would give us a hearing in behalf of ourselves and our posterity, with respect to the return of those Tory villains from the enemy who have been the cause of so much distress, conflagration, and bloodshed in our country. From our situation, we know their dispositions at the time of their deserting the cause of the United States. We are also very sensible that the instant these miscreants saw their countrymen, as they judged, breathing out their last expiring groans, they flew to the assistance of our murderers and displayed their talents against us in the most vigorous and savage-like manner possibly to be invented. These guys hate the loyalists. I mean, hate them. And this is, think back to that document earlier with the Belvins coming to put out the fire of the Raymond's barn, and now the Raymonds are turning around going, these guys are awful. They murdered us. They're the biggest villains possible, right? So 8 years of this conflict now, and the devastation that's been caused by it, and people are furious. And they're talking about the return of the Tories. So in some cases, actually, Tories were kicked out of communities. Some Tories fled because of how dangerous it was. There's a unique example that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But this goes on. You know, these guys talk about these crimes seeming of the blackest dye. They must, they stolen our fathers and brothers from their beds, sacrificed them by cold and hunger to their worst, their infernal dispositions. Our murdered brothers scarred by cold in their graves. You know, this is their writing going, how awful these people are. So what do you think happens to the Loyalists when they return to the community? Well, in one instance, things don't go great. This is the house of a man by the name of Joe Burlock. If you're a Wiltonian, you may recognize it as Trackside Teen Center, but during the conflict, this was owned by Joe Burlock. Burlock was a Loyalist, a pretty vocal one at that, here in Wilton. He was arrested in 1777 for being accused of being a spy, but later was released when he lied and said that he was loyal to the crown, or loyal to the Patriot cause, because within a day of being released from prison, he immediately fled to Long Island. And his house was confiscated and was taken over by a Patriot. When Job returned after the war was over, that letter bears out because Job was actually shot and killed on the doorstep of this house. And no one was ever charged with the murder, because as far as the community was concerned, Job Burlock got what he deserved. He was these Tory villains with crimes of blackest dye. His widow, Esther, was one of the few dozen Loyalists who actually left Wilton and actually fled to Canada after the war ended, because obviously they were killing Loyalists. Burlock was also involved in one of the more notable Revolutionary War stories with Wilton, which is the King George statue story. Show of hands, who's familiar with the King George statue story? Oh, most people. I will run through it fairly quickly. In July of 1776, the British ripped down a statue of King George that was standing in Bowling Green in New York City. King George dressed as a golden Roman emperor, real, humble guy. The statue, interestingly enough, was actually created by an artist named Joseph Wilton, no relation to the town, just a cool historical coincidence that I like to share. The statue was made of lead, so they smashed up the statue, and the Patriots decided they were going to turn it into musket balls, because what is metaphorical justice other than melting down the king to fire him back at His Majesty's troops? The statue came to Wilton, actually came to the Raymond House, which was operating at a tavern as a tavern at the time. And while it was there, pieces of the statue were stolen by local Loyalists, one of which we believe is Joe Burlock. And they threw it into the swamp near Samuel Belden's house, which is now known as Crown Pond, as they pulled pieces of the king out of it. And we just so happen to have a piece of the statue that was found many years later in our collection. You can see it in the lobby on your way out. I highly recommend it. So what do you think happens to the other Loyalists that were in Wilton at the start of the war? If Joe Burlock's being shot dead on his doorstep, surely somebody like David Lambert, wealthiest guy in the community, it's a revolution. We're tearing down the hierarchy. We're getting rid of these people. We're going to, rebuild society in our image. So what do you think happens to David Lambert? Well, basically nothing. Lambert remains in Wilton throughout the war. He remains incredibly prominent in Wilton. You can see the Lambert House here, owned by the Historical Society. Actually, one of the first buildings we actually owned, one of the oldest houses in Wilton. And Lambert basically goes on to be continuing a prominent member of the community. He actually helps to found St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. As an Anglican, he stays within the faith, but obviously with the separation of the Church of England, he joins the Episcopal faith and founds St. Matthew's, and also is immediately elected one of the selectmen of Wilton and is one of Wilton's earliest town clerks. And the Lamberts continue to be fairly prominent in the community for another 100 years or so. They have some interesting stories that may be another lecture, but you can see that the Lambert House here is actually on the Wilton town seal. So the Lamberts were prominent enough that when they put the town seal together, they said, oh yeah, we should honor these people. And sort of their loyalty to the crown is disregarded. Samuel Belden, again, one of the wealthiest men in the community. He's a perfect example of a guy who basically just rejoined society. Maybe his actions during the Battle of Ridgefield actually paid off. But he also is a co-founder of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. You can see St. Matthew's as it would have looked like in the 19th century. This building is still here. It was the Wilton Baptist Church for a little bit, and now it's privately owned. But Samuel Belden, this would have been actually right across the street from his store. So the Beldens go on, also join town government. Actually, I believe Samuel Belden's involved in a couple different government projects throughout the 19th century. So basically, other than a few maybe insults here and there during the Revolution, he pretty much goes on to remain at the top of society once the war ends. So are we getting a picture here of, again, that question of, is this a complete remake of society or not? And I think a good example of sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum, and it's not necessarily Wilton related or even Connecticut related, but I think he's an interesting example, is Thomas Paine. Paine is familiar for writing, we probably know him for writing Common Sense in 1776, one of the real, early advocates for revolution. He is, as much of a firebrand as anybody at the start of the conflict. But as the war continued, he sort of falls out of favor, and it's because he is truly a revolutionary. Paine actually ran into conflict with a Connecticut native, a man by the name of Silas Deane. You may be familiar with the name. Deane was one of the financiers of the revolution, and he was actually tasked with going overseas to France to help barter for supplies. And Paine basically accuses Deane of being a war profiteer. He says France was going to give this stuff for free, but you're charging them and keeping the money. And Deane, again, one of the wealthiest men in Connecticut at the time, he has the other wealthy founding fathers immediately rush to his defense to discredit Paine and basically say, Paine, what are you talking about? Deane is an upstanding member of the community. How dare you speak ill of somebody who was who is doing all this work? And it may be because some of these founding fathers were also profiting off of the fact that they were fighting this revolution to an extent. And Paine actually is at one point assaulted in Philadelphia because of what he said about Silas Deane being, hey, you're not doing this for the cause, you're doing it for your own good. And it's not till Silas Deane's really open corruption comes out a few years later that Paine actually gets sort of a public apology from some of the people who had, yelled at, said that, how dare you speak ill of one of, Connecticut's favorite sons. This would not be the last time that Thomas Paine actually runs into issues because of his very outspoken revolutionary attitudes. So one of the things that Paine writes in 1780 is a pamphlet called Public Good, one of his lesser known pamphlets. But among other things, one of the things that Paine is advocating for is that when the war ends, the U.S. is going to acquire all of this land to the west of the colonies, the states that are now Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, those places. And he makes the case that the land should be used for he quote, considered as the common right of all. He doesn't want this to be privately owned land. He believes the government should take it and use it to pay off soldiers, help pay off the country's debt, and sort of be used as a common space for all the citizens of the United States. And this annoyed an incredible amount of the founding fathers. A lot of these founding fathers are very wealthy landowners. You think about Washington, Jefferson, Richard Henry Lee. These are Virginians who are incredibly wealthy, and they had been land speculators. And as the conflict goes on, they have their eyes, they either purchased or were trying to purchase these lands that they realized that the United States was going to acquire. And Paine writing this is cutting into their profit margin to the point that actually Paine falls somewhat into debt as the war continues on. Again, he's losing friends. So the war's over in 1784, there's actually a resolution put in place to sort of support Thomas Paine and provide him with some funds, and it actually fails in Congress because so many people are furious with him. I mean, Paine is, again, a really outspoken person. He's an abolitionist. He starts supporting things like America's first social safety net. He starts advocating for money for newborns. He starts advocating for universal basic income for the poor. I mean, he's like he's the Bernie Sanders of the 1780s. And this is annoying so many of these wealthy founding fathers that don't really want, again, to upset the apple cart. So I found a letter here from 1784. This is Richard Henry Lee. Again, the Lees are as blue blood Virginians as you get. And Lee basically writes, who's in Congress at the time, he says, I wish I had been there because I would have voted for this thing to help support Thomas Paine, but I wasn't there. But he says I would have done that on his behalf despite, and it says, I've been told that the proposition in his favor miscarried, basically the proposition failed, from it being observed that he had shown enmity to this state by having written a pamphlet injurious to our claim on the Western Territory. And sort of the subtle double language here is when Lee says our claim, he means the country, but what he really means is my claim to the Western Territory. So, Lee remains friends with Paine, but he's also saying, listen, this guy's making enemies for the fact that he's proposing something really radical here. And Paine actually goes on, Paine gets into some trouble later. He joins the French Revolution. Talk about true revolutions. Paine gets into trouble, he goes overseas. He's arrested at one point. He actually makes several appeals to the United States to prove that he's a US citizen. He was living in England briefly, and he was arrested on charge of being an English citizen in France during the Revolution, which was a no-no. And Paine actually tried several times to get his US citizenship sort of approved, and it wasn't with, and actually James Monroe had to step in personally on his behalf to basically get him out of prison. But Paine actually wrote a letter about George Washington much later, basically calling Washington a coward because he didn't help Paine when the time came. And after he writes the letter, Monroe actually kicks Paine out of his house because he's like, whoa, 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 you can't be saying that. So the last thing I'll point out is something in our collection. This is from the New Haven Gazette and Connecticut Magazine. It was a publication published in the late 1780s by a man by the name of Josiah Meigs. Meigs was a Yale-educated New Haven resident. He would later go on to be the first president of the University of Georgia. And in the September 87 edition, and keep that date in mind, September 1787, in that edition, we find this ad, which is a $3 reward for a Negro man who had fled enslavement in Greens Farms, today Westport. And he had fled, and there was a $3 reward. And I hate to say I like this, that's not the right term, but I find this really interesting because September 1787 is when the final draft of the US Constitution is written. So here's this document that is the culmination of this revolution, and now I can air quote revolution if you'd like. Here is this revolution. The culmination of it is this founding document, this thing that's supposed to be a transformative thing of our society. And yet, who is it transformative for? Has society been turned on its head when you see something like this with an enslaved man who is still trying to escape his bondage? So I get back to the question that we started at the top, which was how revolutionary. And I tend to agree with Stevenson, where is the American Revolution truly a revolution, or is it just a movement for independence? You think about the idea of representative democracy is not fairly radical at the time, but the idea of representative democracy goes back to ancient times. There were certainly different types of republics all across Europe and in Italy and other places at centuries before the American Revolution. Is this an example of a revolution, or is this just a restaurant under new management? You compare it to the French Revolution that comes later, where the French Revolution is this attempt to completely remake French society from the bottom up. I mean, they changed the months of the calendar, for crying out loud. They were trying to do, all sorts of things. You think about the Haitian Revolution that comes a few years after that, directly inspired by the American Revolution, but very different in its intent to, redistribute wealth, redistribute land, change the social hierarchy. And even the European revolutions of the 1840s, again, this attempt to really recreate a society to benefit many people. And I think when we look at the revolution, it's more of an instance of people society remaining quite the way that it was. If you were, a soldier in Wilton and went off fighting and you came back, life really didn't change for you all that much, generally speaking. Yeah, you paid taxes to different people, but it's still pretty much the same government, it's still the same setup as before. So I just think it's interesting, with the bicentennial of the United States coming up next year in 2026, and we talk about what does America stand for, and it's certainly, this is not meant to be anything negative necessarily, but I think if we talk about the spirit of 1776 and consider what the revolution really stood for, I think we need to consider the fact that maybe it wasn't as revolutionary as we thought, and what the attempt to make a society, maybe it was more making a template to bring change, but did it really bring change itself? Well, that's a question that we could debate as long as we'd like. Well, at least till about 7:30 tonight, because that's when we close. But with that, I am happy to answer any and all questions, and thank you so much for coming out to join us. I hope this was somewhat enlightening. And yeah, if there's questions, I can take some from the crowd, or if you want to just chat later. Yes?
Well, I would ask how revolutionary is defined, from what perspective, because with relationship to King George and the Parliament, this was a revolutionary event in the history of the world to throw off the king, who was still associated with being a representative God on earth. If you're just looking at it in terms of how much it changed American social structure or economic structure, you might have a different answer.
I think that's a good point. It is a matter of perspective. I would argue that throwing off a king is not maybe as unique. I mean, even in English history, there's examples of, Magna Carta was an attempt to sort of put rings on the king. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 is another attempt where they basically got rid of a king, replaced them for someone else, but still sort of within a parliamentary structure. There are examples of sort of overthrowing kings. You look at something like I'm going to get real niche here, the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth of the 16th century. They had a sort of dynastic king and said, we're not going to do this anymore. We're going to elect a king from a group of people, but we're not really going to have, a true king. So I don't disagree with you, but it is a matter of perspective. But I would argue that it's not, even from certain perspectives, not a total step out of into left field.
Well, but even on that level, what we ended up with when the Constitution was ratified in the person of George Washington was not a king, but a democratically, by the standards of the time, elected president.
Oh, sure. Yeah. No, I'm not attempting to, I'm not arguing that this is not a change. I'm just suggesting that it's not as radical as we may think. I mean, there were certainly people within the American government who wanted Washington to be a king. And even still, if we're looking at purely from king and using that very somewhat narrow focus, I mean, you think about some of the other things that the Continental Congress or the Constitution put into place that I would argue is very undemocratic. Something like the Senate, which again is democratically elected, but is inherently changing, proportions of who they represent. So there's certainly aspects of it that are, democratic in theory, but how democratic are they? Again, this is all, anytime you talk to a historian, there's always going to be this is way more nuanced and complicated. I totally understand your point. I'm not trying to dismiss your point at all. I think, again, from a matters perspective, this was quite radical. But if we start looking at it from the point of a transformation of society, I think it really falls short of a true revolution. Yes?
You might also say that although the Declaration of Independence blames all of the complaints on a king, as though he is personally responsible, by the late 1700s, Parliament was absolutely the governing body. And yes, of course, the king, it was still a kingdom, but as I always say, George III was the first Hanoverian king who could speak English. So, first two, of course, having only spoken German. So, they, as a manifesto, it worked to blame it all on a single harsh king. But in fact, at that point, Parliament was running Great Britain.
Yeah. No, this is a good example of head of state versus head of government, where the head of government would have been the Parliament, or in this case, I think it was William Pitt was the Prime Minister at the time. I could be wrong. Don't look that up. But King George, as the sort of head of state, and being as this representative figurehead, it's easy to draw a caricature of King George. It's hard to draw a caricature of Parliament. So again, by removing this. It's interesting they remove the king sort of as their government, but they sort of just create a parliamentary, not a parliamentary system, but sort of their own version of, a representative democracy as the House of Commons would have been over here. So yeah, I think this goes into this idea of, what is the sliding scale of revolution, that I don't know if it has a correct answer. I'm sort of purposely leaving this open-ended. But what I'm hoping to sort of get is this idea of, so we can have this debate of how revolutionary was this indeed. Getting rid of a king, certainly. Creating a sort of second version of Parliament just over here, slightly different. Yeah. Yeah, you can hem and haw all you want. Yes?
I learned something today, coincidentally, on the day of your talk that I didn't know, that I thought you might be interested in, if I could blabber on for a moment, because I'm part of this Irish genealogy, kind of like it's called the Green Room. It's like an email thing that comes from Ireland, And I just was flipping through it. It comes every week at the middle of the week. But it was interesting. This week's question was, some lady was researching her ancient relative who, you know how the English used to send people to Van Diemen's Land in Australia for punishment? So her question was, why were Irish convicts sent to Australia? So the interesting part is, he goes into a long explanation, but he starts out by saying, from America to Australia, the shift in transportation destinations. So what he writes is that transportation as punishment for a crime had a long history in the British Empire, but the destinations changed significantly over time. Then he says the first period is the American period, 1718 to 1776. Transportation to the American colonies began formally with the Transportation Act in 1718. Approximately 50,000 convicts from Britain and Ireland, because Ireland was owned by Britain.
Yep.
So approximately 50,000 convicts from Britain and Ireland were sent to America. The American Revolution in 1776 closed this option for the British authorities, right? Because we were now against them, we weren't taking the prisoners anymore. So I thought that was really interesting because there were a whole lot of pissed off people over here who were of Irish descent who would love to fight in the revolution.
Yeah, there is a long history of people coming here both of their own volition and not so much kind of having to leave the British Isles. There was also a point where King George was doing the opposite, or I'll say King George, but the British were doing the opposite, where they were taking American troublemakers and sending them elsewhere to sort of breaking this up. So yeah, I do think that there was a sort of a nice breeding ground of discontent here for a lot of different reasons.
Common man.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Bill.
It's a very interesting etching you've got on your first slide. I wonder if you would just tell us the story.
Oh, the etching, I'd have to look back, but this is an etching of the Battle of Ridgefield.
Is that Danbury burning and it is?
Yes, it is. Yeah, I don't know how accurate the etching is, but yes, it is meant to be Danbury burning in the background and the British marching on to Ridgefield. I've seen this in quite a few, and if you look up Battle of Ridgefield image, this is like the first thing that pops up, so it was convenient for me. Yes, I think Bob, you had a question?
Yeah. You say that we changed one government to another government, but the fact is, did the citizens, I'm thinking of taxation without representation, did the citizens in American colonies have the rights that citizens in the British counties had? You see, it's the same government, but was it the same, did they have the same rights that the people in Britain had?
Similar. Some of the specifics I'd have to look into. Broadly speaking, I mean, for most of this, the Americans considered themselves British citizens and subjects. So, a lot of the laws that are put in place are very much based on, sort of British or English common law as it was presented. If we go down the list of rights for everybody, I'm sure there's.
Did they have representatives in Parliament?
Oh no! Once they had separated, no, they were no longer part of any.
Before the revolution.
Oh, there were. Not there. Yes and no. Like there were some people overseas. They didn't quite have as much voting power. Again, it's a little bit. The specifics it would take forever to explain. But I know that there was people went over there, but there wasn't much voting. Even if they could vote, they were being outvoted. So yeah, it was a little bit in between. Yes.
There was like an American representative in London, but it wasn't a voting member of
Right.
Parliament. That was the argument.
Yeah.
And then there were different definitions, I think, of property. One of the reasons that the Brits were so afraid of the American Revolution is that 95% of people in Britain, the Scots, the Irish, a lot of the English, did not own property and therefore could not vote. So if you have this revolution, it might expand the definition of property so more people could vote. It's a threat to the homeland too.
Oh sure. Yeah. Again, this goes in the thing of they're expanding suffrage in the United States, but again, you have, black people, African Americans can't vote, women can't vote. There's a whole bevy of people. There were other obstacles to voting, both official and otherwise. Again, it's getting this sort of the nuance of it, but obviously the American separation from England is a change. But again, is it a giant step? Is it a half step? I mean, you see the same thing take place with the French Revolution later, where all of Europe panics because they get rid of a king and really start talking about not only get rid of a king, but completely transforming an economic system. And again, redistributing property, all sorts of things like that. So the French Revolution terrified, actually the Haitian Revolution immediately after that, where they were looking at justice based on racial grounds, which was a completely, you want to talk about radical, that is about as radical a step as you can take. And that scares the Europeans like unbelievable. The Americans didn't even want to support the Haitian Revolution because they were so terrified of this idea of sort of racial equality. So yeah, again, I guess what this comes down to, if I plot 40 revolutions on the screen and we were to rank them from radicalness, I think the American Revolution would probably be in the bottom half. I guess again, this is all just opinion. I'm just trying to give us a sense of the context in which we're talking about what radical step in changing government. I'm here all day tomorrow, so if you want to come in and yell at me. Well, thank you so much. I hope you have a lovely evening. We have a bunch more programs coming up soon. If you would like to check out the King George statue piece, please do. You can also grab our little fake newspaper that we made a few years ago that is meant to be a Wilton newspaper during the Revolution. You can grab that on your way out. We have a few copies. But otherwise, enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much, and take care.